Hello, and welcome to another edition of Coffee with Comrades, a podcast discussing current events, theory, and action through a radical lens. Hey, we are right back at it again with yet another episode of Coffee with Comrades. This week, I sat down with my new friends and comrades at the Green and Red podcast to chat about the potential of unrest following the 2020 election and what you can do in the streets to protect yourself and your comrades. But before we get there, a couple quick announcements. I've had a number of people write into the show recently about episode 105 of Coffee with Comrades, No Government, No Problem, and I wanted to clear the air on a couple of recurrent questions folks have posed. First things first, I'm sad to say that the episode we'd recorded on social ecology was unfortunately botched. While I was pleased with the sound quality of the Socialism, Communism, and Anarchy introductory workshop series, it wasn't perfect, but it wasn't terrible. It was at least listenable. The audio for the social ecology episode just wasn't quite there for some reason. And as a result, I decided to nix that episode from the series. However, we absolutely intend to chat about social ecology more in the future. My partner actually was recently reading Post-Scarcity Anarchism, and it reignited my interest in Bookchin's theories and the emergence of different strands of communalism, like democratic confederalism, which was championed by Abdullah Öcalan. So rest assured, we'll definitely be doing more episodes on social ecology in the future. Fear not. If you're really desperate to get your social ecological fix, however, I'd recommend Seriously Wrong's recent episode with the Institute for Social Ecology, which we will link to in the show notes. And speaking of post-scarcity anarchism, we did an episode on Bookchin's prescient essay almost a year ago titled Anarchy or Annihilation, which is episode 61, and we will also link to that in the show notes. Secondly, I have had some good faith critiques of my language regarding AntiSiv and AnarchoPrimitivism in episode 105 that I'd like to address just a little bit for the sake of clarity. Contrary to any impressions I might have given, I actually have read some AntiSiv or AnPrim theory. Back in 2013, I read Deep Green Resistance by noted transphobe Derek Jensen, and sometime around 2015 or 2016, I also engaged with some of John Zerzan's work, namely his 1999 work Against Civilization and his essay Future Primitive. Last year, I read the anonymously penned essay Desert on the recommendation of my friend Tim from the Soulcast, and plenty of folks say Desert is anti-civ, even if it's more like nihilistic than anything else, but we won't split hairs. So I think it's fair to say I haven't engaged deeply with AntiSiv or anarcho-primitivist texts, but I have read a bit. And I think the main reason that I'm generally disinterested in anti-civ arguments is because they've always struck me as individualist or lifestyleist, and I think anarchism is at its best when it synthesizes individual liberty and self-actualization with communal emancipation and voluntary association, both the individual and the community simultaneously. Which, of course, isn't to say that all anti-civ arguments are necessarily against community, but they are generally against organized mass society, which I personally think is a really serious shortcoming in the modern era. Now, as per questions of gender expression and identity that crop up in anti-civ or anarcho-primitivist circles, there are really odious sectors of the DGR movement in particular, as well as certain reactionary strains of so-called liberation movements that have noxious strains of gender essentialism that I have encountered firsthand doing anti-frackling and anti-pipeline organizing in real life. So, like, a large part of this animosity or ambivalence or whatever you want to call it that I have for anarcho-primitivism or anti-civ thinking comes from my practical engagement with self-proclaimed anprims and anti-civ folks. And it's really sadly left a really foul taste in my mouth when I ran into these folks in real life sometimes. I ran into lots of post-leftist and anti-civ folks in the rural South who were doing good work organizing against the Sable Trail pipeline, for example, but had some pretty reprehensible views on gender and patriarchy. That said, I do have anti-civ friends and comrades who I love and appreciate who do not hold these virulent views on gender expression or identity, and with whom I gently disagree with on more visionary issues, like the role of civil society, for example. One listener proposed that we can think of AntiSiv writings as a way to critique industrial society broadly. And while I think that's a cool idea and it's a good way of understanding AntiSiv philosophy, my fear or impression is that much of AntiSiv writing is pure critique rather than the presentation of an alternative to the capitalist mode of production. And while I am all for critique, there is an urgent need to give folks a vision of what the world they're fighting for might look like, even if it's just in broad strokes, and one that goes beyond let's go into the forest and live off the land, especially considering most folks don't know how to do that. This has been something that I've run into time and time again when talking to friends or to family members. They'll say, yeah, Pearson, this anarchy thing is all well and good, or it looks good on paper, but what would it look like? How would it practically play out? And I kind of used to agree with like the Chomsky approach, which is that it isn't necessarily helpful to be prescriptive. And while I think that's still true, like as a general rule, because, direct democracy has looked different in given specific cultural contexts and material conditions in the areas and territories where it arises, anarchists do our poignant philosophy a disservice when we refuse to engage in the visionary process of world building and prefiguring those alternatives to capitalism and the state. Lastly, a whole lot of episode 5 was, frankly, just me kind of speaking off the cuff based off of some ideas that I threw together for a discussion series. And I think I definitely could have done a better job of ensuring that I didn't create any straw man arguments. Because I always hate it when people create straw man arguments. It's weak and ineffectual, and it's bad in discussion. It doesn't do anyone any favors. And so I apologize if that's how it came across. If folks are interested in learning more about this stuff from a nuanced and engaging perspective, I recommend they check out our sister show on the Channel Zero network, Primal Anarchy, hosted by my comrade, Kevin Tucker. Speaking of the Channel Zero network, check out this jingle for Kevin's show.
You were born a hunter-gatherer. You were born a social animal, one that moves within the land and moves between bands in a world that was meant to be less measured, less exact. We were meant for lives with more meaning and less consequence. A life where connection and meaning are implicit, where animals have voices and trees have stories. A world where rivers flow unabated and water isn't a health hazard. A world without fences, a world without flags, a world without rulers and gods. It's our world, the world of Primal Anarchy.
We are here to say that either the world burns or the cities do. We're here to say that abusers convince you that you have no choice. We're here to say that marketers convince you that you have their options. We're here to say that you are wild, that you can be free. We're here to say that there's a match in one hand and bull cutters in the other. And we aren't here to say that the world is waiting. We are here to say that the world is fighting. We are here to say that their story only ends one way. And we're here to tell you that there are others.
Primal Anarchy Podcast is a collection of rants, tirades, condemnations, readings, musings, explorations, response, interviews, and iterations, hosted by Primal Anarchist writers Kevin and Natasha Tucker.
Find us online at primalanarchy.org, all major podcast platforms, and the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network.
Lastly, I just wanted to personally thank all of the new folks who have joined our Patreon this month. There has been like a really awesome outpouring of love for this show that I haven't really seen in months, so I really fucking appreciate it. If you dig this show, if these conversations and dialogues speak to you, then please consider signing up to become a sustaining member of the program by going to www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades to support the show for as little as $1 a month. All right, I'll get out of your hair. Please enjoy episode 107 of Coffee with Comrades. See you in the streets, featuring the Red and Green Podcast.
As protests heat up, the Channel Zero Network has some reminders on how to stay safe while out in the streets.
Bring buddies and don't let them out of the range of your voice.
Write a legal aid number on your bodies so you can get help if you get arrested. Be sure to know your buddies' legal names and birthdays. You'll need these to help find them if they're arrested.
When moving around, walk, don't run. Stick together.
Turn off your phone while out in the streets to avoid surveillance of your location, and so as not to have your unlocked phone taken by the authorities or other bad actors.
Try your best not to stick out in a crowd. Cover up tattoos with clothing or body paint. Cops will use footage from the protest to try to identify you.
Wear clothes that are good for moving quickly. Avoid wearing jewelry and wear closed-toed shoes.
Wear your mask at all times, even if you're talking to someone, in order to guard yourself against surveillance, COVID-19, pepper spray, and tear gas.
Avoid wearing contact lenses. Bring goggles of some kind in case of tear gas or pepper spray.
Consider wearing bike helmets, as police often cause head injuries with batons and other weapons.
Don't take photos or videos of people doing anything illegal or with their faces uncovered. Whenever possible, film the cops, not the protesters.
Only put water in your eyes. Don't use milk or baking soda or anything else. Clean water is the safest thing to use at a protest. If possible, bring a water bottle to drink from and a water bottle to flush out the eyes of any comrades who are maced or tear gassed.
And white comrades are encouraged to follow the lead of black and brown comrades, as they bear the brunt of state brutality.
Follow Unicorn Riot and Channel Zero Network member It's Going Down for ongoing updates.
The Channel Zero Network sends you all solidarity.
Stay safe out there and never stop fighting for a better world.
So this week we have a special collaborative edition of Coffee with Comrades featuring our friends in the Green and Red podcast. What's up, y'all?
Hey, welcome. Thank you. Not welcome. Thank you. I think we're on our own. So,
I mean, we technically are, we're collaborating, so, it works. Well, listen, for listeners who may not be aware of your program, can you tell me what the show is about and kind of how you two got started?
Sure. We're the Green and Red podcast. I'm Scott, and this is Bob, and we're longtime friends, longtime comrades. We both come out of academics around history and politics and things like that. I'll let Bob tell a little bit more about himself when we get to that part. But last year we decided that we had a lot of things to say and a lot of comments, and we basically kind of wanted to do some media around it. And so we started the Green and Red podcast, Scrappy Media for Scrappy Radicals. And have been sort of kind of building up to it since about a year now, I think is when we first came up with the idea. And then we launched in February, and we have a host of guests, everything from like organizers and activists to journalists to academics, because we both come out of a history academic background. We actually have a lot of what I call standalone episodes where we talk about like historical things that we think are important. We've had recently, some of those have been around the anniversary of the Watts riots, and we've also had a episode recently on New Left historians, things like that.
Hell yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah, I'm a professor of history. I teach classes in, U.S. foreign policy is kind of my specialty in the Vietnam War in the 60s, but I teach classes in radical history and class struggle and protest and, globalization and stuff like that as well. And Scott and I, got together in Houston many, many years ago, where we were very active in creating, I think, one of the most impressive activist groups that Houston has seen, in our time. And we've been talking about this a long time. And, I looked at your guest list on your website, and I think you have kind of the same approach that we do, which is to get people on who are actually doing things, who aren't like what I call the lefty media superstars, to kind of give a voice to people who really need to be heard, who are out there, activists and people in the streets and people who are doing mutual aid and anarchists and that kind of guests. So I think we're definitely in sync on that. And it's, really cool to kind of be here and talking to you about that.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah, I'm glad that we could finally make it happen. I was telling y'all before we hopped on the pod that I was looking forward to trying to collaborate with y'all, and I'm glad we could find the time to talk about it. Briefly, you guys both mentioned that you've been around the block and have been doing this work for some time now. But how did y'all first get into radical politics? Did you guys meet each other in the streets, or was it something that emerged more organically through the academy? What did that kind of look like for y'all?
About this time 20 years ago, I was a grad student in one of Bob's classes called Empire, War, and Globalization. And it was the sort of it was right after the WTO protests had happened. It was around the time that A16 in DC was happening. And we were teacher-student, then we were friends, and then we began organizing together. And we did a lot of global justice work in Houston, which led into a lot of anti-war work. We actually were leaders in a campaign against Halliburton, a huge war profiteering company that was headquartered in Houston at the time.
That's awesome. Hell yeah.
Yeah, I think the Halliburton thing, as I look back on it, was really one of the coolest things we did. We started before the war, and I think Wednesday, we'd have a vigil out there for about 2 months before March of 2003, and, got a lot of attention. A lot of people were coming out. So, but, before that, I think one of the problems that you'll see in any movement is that we were doing this really cool globalization work around the WTO and NAFTA and CAFTA and all those kinds of things. And then 9/11 hit, and we kind of shifted to dealing with like the war, which I think is kind of something you'll see a lot of times when you have these activist groups who are doing good work. Like in the 60s, you had, SDS and SNCC and all these really cool, really hardcore organizations. And then Vietnam kind of dominated everything. And I think that kind of what happened to us too. And it's something to kind of look out for, I think, all the time. You're doing really cool stuff, and then everybody stops what they're doing to go deal with some other crisis. And I think that's kind of what happened to us. But what we were doing was really cool.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think that's an important lesson, is to not get like swept up sometimes, and to keep the old nose to the grindstone and keep on doing the good work wherever it is or however humble it might seem.
I'll also say that kind of important distinction of like the work that we did when we were organizing in those days, like 19, 20 years ago, up through even the podcast days. We actually very much brought like an anti-capitalist lens to it, where there was a lot of, within movements, there's a lot of, sometimes what I see is like a lot of kind of liberal reformist politics, and we're kind of bringing this kind of more this different sort of critique, which I don't think is always like ingested really well by people who come from like a more mainstream background or who haven't had a sort of more radical education.
Yeah, 100%. Well, I definitely wanted to take some time today to talk with you about some of this historical kind of perspective, especially because we are, in the midst of like we're kind of reaching the end of a summer of uprisings, right? Uprisings that have just absolutely swept all across the United States, protests in solidarity with Black and Indigenous folks, in particular, with Black Lives Matter. And with the U.S. election just around the corner, the Trump administration has signaled again and again that it's pretty unwilling to cede power in the event of its loss at the ballot box. And as our friends in It's Going Down pointed out, and really excellent podcast that I can't recommend enough, that I'll link to in the show notes, this kind of presents a threat to democracy such as it exists in the U.S., but it also really represents like what could, potentially amount to a coup in the Oval Office. And so I think that like now is probably a really great time to situate ourselves both in thinking about ways to struggle meaningfully against authoritarianism in the streets, in a practical and material way, but also thinking through the history of it. And so like ahead of the election, I really wanted to take some time to talk about the history of street actions with y'all, and maybe also provide tips and pointers and practical advice for militant struggle against the state. So I kind of want to just kind of open up to y'all. Like, we talked a little bit about some of the ways that we could potentially segue into a discussion of history, but like in many ways, the history of street action has a very storied roots here in the Imperial Core. So, where do y'all want to begin with it?
We could go back to Bacon's Rebellion if you want that.
We really could.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, like, we could literally, the history of the U.S. in a certain way is the history of street action.
Yeah. I think, Scott knows the actual idiosyncrasies of street action much better than I do. I come at it more kind of, intellectually or scholastically or whatever. But I will say that, what I'm seeing this year, and in terms of what I've either seen in my life or what I've studied is indeed really remarkable. Just, the numbers of people. What's really, I think, to me, the most hopeful sign of what we've seen is that what we have now is this kind of multi-generational, multiracial mass of people in the streets who aren't listening to the Democratic Party, and they're not listening to union bosses or whatever. They've kind of spontaneously, organically taken this action, and that's really encouraging to me. It's something that I think is really essential, because we don't have the infrastructure in the United States on the left to kind of have these kinds of things. We don't have like, labor parties and socialist parties and, hardcore radical unionism for the most part, since the Wobblies or whatever. So I think it's really cool to see these organic movements just kind of like blow up out of well, not out of nowhere. Obviously, if you follow the role of police in the United States, you know that it didn't come out of nowhere. But I think that's really encouraging and hope gives me some hope for the future.
100%.
Yeah, the other thing I would say about that is I don't know how much people in the streets, I know at a certain level that people in the streets are taking cues from what's going on internationally. But like, what we saw particularly in 2019 in places like Chile and Colombia and Lebanon and Haiti, I think have been actually fairly instructive for U.S. movements. Like, we actually had an episode in August where we talked to a couple of anonymous street organizers in Portland who actually, told us that they had actually spent a lot of time studying, tactics that were being used in Chile and Hong Kong and places like that. We see that you see the umbrellas, you see the laser pointers, people are gearing up in a serious sort of way. And I think, I feel like what's been going on in the rest of the world in the last couple of years has been fairly instructive. And I think folks in the US are embracing that. And then I also feel like historically, we're also seeing like a certain level of people looking back towards that. I think I've been thinking a lot about, like, there's a lot of calls for general strikes to the point where even some of the union bosses, like people like Sarah Nelson, the head of the flight attendants, has actually been talking about a general strike. And so I think back about like the sit down strikes in the 30s and places like Flint. And I when I think about this sort of moment that we're in, where we're seeing the system boiling over with COVID and with like all sorts of, the economy is crashing and the rise of these like far right militias. I think back to the 30s where we had this period of a thunder on the left, which is happening now and not talked about in the media the way that some of the like right wing is. And I feel like that's a sort of important place for folks to be looking at.
Yeah, well said. Well, there's a couple things that you guys are touching on that I'm really interested in, and I think the first one is like internationalism and kind of like where we're at this current juncture, because it strikes me that like we've seen this same kind of thing play out before, but not really certainly not galvanized into like a global proletarian revolution, but there have been people borrowing ideas or taking tactics and strategies, right? I'm thinking, specifically of like the Arab Spring and some of the ways that contributed to Occupy Wall Street and how these things fed into each other. And I'm thinking about, some of these uprisings in 2019 and how they are informing this past summer that we saw these uprisings against police for abolition and in solidarity with Black lives. And so I'm thinking like, I'm wondering if you think that this is kind of a hallmark of like successful street actions is internationalism, because from where I'm sitting, it seems that it's an absolutely indispensable asset to the actual material success of people in struggle.
I think you're right. I think that's one of the problems on the left historically, is that it kind of is very, kind of nationalist actually, in terms of dealing with not just other movements, but on just the issue of imperialism. You have these kind of left icons now in the mainstream, people like AOC or the Squad, who really don't say anything about Venezuela or Bolivia or Cuba. So, I think, having these cross references with other places is really important. 1968 was like that. You had Chicago, and you had the uprising in the spring of 1968 after Martin Luther King's assassination, but you also had Paris and Prague, even though that was different. I think it's when the ruling class understands internationalism really well. They get it, they know it, and they collaborate across national boundaries based on their class interests. And I think we need to do that too, because there's so many more of us than there are of them. So totally. Absolutely, I think you're totally right. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. Scott, want to throw on that?
Yeah, I think that kind of like actually hits on what I think. I do think that there's a cross pollination that happens across borders, but I think it's nothing like what the ruling class is doing, and it kind of like I remember when Occupy happened, I was working with this one particular activist group, and I was actually sharing a lot of like information about like what the Zapatistas had done. And like so many Occupy activists like kind of like shot back at me or at the post I was putting up about like, who are the Zapatistas? Who is Subcomandante Marcos, and why should I care? And
Totally.
And I always felt like that was a little bit of a disservice. I really kind of like cut my teeth in the anti-corporate globalization movement, anti-corporate globalization movement, and I actually felt very much like we were like had very much like this grasp of internationalism, and like we were following the cue of the Zapatistas uprising in '94 and all that sort of stuff. And I feel like it's, even though we're like so globally connected, and there is like a little democratic thing that happens with the internet, is like I also feel like people are like fairly like, you know, oblivious or ignorant about some of these other international movements. Maybe I'm wrong, but
no, I mean, I think
it comes across that way to me.
I mean, I think you are absolutely right. I mean, I'd be the first to admit that I'm in many ways ignorant of some of the stuff that's been happening in 2019, mostly because, like, to be perfectly honest, like, there's just so much happening here, you know? And so, like, you know, part of it is trying to balance, you know, the sort of both and, right? You know, the struggle in a local context and in a national context, while not forgetting the international struggle and figuring out ways that you can contribute to it in different ways. And I'm curious, you know, do you think, Scott, that we're getting past that kind of hubris and that we're beginning to unlearn our sort of American exceptionalism and you know, reach out across these international borders? Or do you think that we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes?
I worry that we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes. I do take heart that last year I did see like a lot of activists talking about Chile and Colombia and Hong Kong and Spain and Paris, Hong Kong and Chile in particular. I don't see as much of a reference to it in like movement circles now. It's all very, I mean, to be honest, I actually don't even see as much of a reference to other parts of the US. Like, you know, things in Portland are all about Portland, less about like what's going on in New York or Chicago or Louisville. And I definitely think that there's like a lack of international solidarity. And I think there's sometimes even a lack of solidarity within corridors in the US. Maybe I could be over thinking that and misreading that though.
What do you think, Bob?
Well, yeah, this could occasion a long rant, so I'll try to abridge it. But no, I think, you know, what we saw at the beginning was really great. You know, you have this organic uprising, and you know, I think there was a response to it. You had, you know, a lot of it is the co-optation strategy, right? Where you have these corporations spend millions of dollars to put out Black Lives Matter propaganda and stuff like that, which, you know, has a purpose. I'm not in any way, you know, saying it's bad, but and so you had that. But initially, you know, when that happens, usually then that co-optation strategy really kind of kicks in, and you know, the kind of the liberal establishment does its part to tamp down on that. And I think that's what we've seen, you know, in the last couple of months, especially because, you know, in the rush of the initial uprisings, you had all these cities saying, yeah, we're going to defund the police. And, you know, you had these kind of police, you know, in some cases were being fired or arrested. And there seemed to be movement. And, you know, whatever did happen in that initial period occurred because there were millions of people in the street. You know, you can have liberal politicians or even Bernie Sanders, and we can talk about that if you want, but, you know, going on. But actually it took street action to do that. But now what we've seen is, let me go off on another little sidebar. One of my favorite historians is Arno Mayer, brilliant guy. And he has this idea, which he kind of carries through European history, about the forces of order and the forces of movement. And the forces of movement will be people in the streets, and the forces of order would be the ruling class. And you have these periods in European history where the forces of movement would get like, you know, momentum and maybe even get an advantage, but then the forces of order would retrench. And I think that's what we're seeing here. And you saw that like in Louisville, with the response to Breonna Taylor, which was the most clumsy, overt cover-up you'll ever see. You see that, and the continued police know they're being attacked for police brutality, police violence. They know they're being recorded by 1,000 people, and they don't care, and they just double down. You see that in Trump's incredibly increasing and ugly overtures toward, you know, overt, violent, white, fascist, supremacist types. So, I think that's one of the problems we have. You had this initial rush and everybody was kind of happy about it, as they should be. It was great. But now, when the dirty work is needed, the ruling class, the forces of order are retrenching and doubling down. And I think that's what we have to deal with. And, I think, we have a habit in the U.S. too of we can talk about whether it's a good idea to vote or not. But I think, just focusing on voting right now to the exclusion of everything else, I think is a big mistake. Yeah. I think that there are different tactics, and the left, I think, has never been good at strategy and tactics. I think they don't really think about that kind of stuff. And so there's a lot of stuff packed in what I just said, but that's kind of my critique of it, that I think there was great momentum and maybe even the initiative, but now it may be getting lost for lots of reasons, some easily understood, some maybe not so much.
No,
So,
I think you're definitely right. It is the vicious cycle of every 4 years you have liberals that are just like, you got to go out and vote, and using weaponizing identity politics and using them as a bludgeon.
Oh, we can talk about that. Okay, good.
Not using an actual liberatory intersectional feminist approach, but using just blatant guilt trips and fear mongering in order to foment a sense of fear. And that's really what it comes down to,
culture.
Right? Yeah, exactly. In so many ways, it's it's really fucking performative, and it doesn't actually gesture towards authentic liberation in any meaningful way. It's just this sort of banal, hand waving and saying oh well, those in power are going to save us, or that's at best. And then at other times, at its most simple, the Trump is bad, we need to get him out of office. That, in many ways, that is what the entirety of the liberal argument can be reduced to in the 2020 election. And I'm hard pressed to think of a more vapid, asinine reason to vote for someone than mean orange guy.
I'm kind of thinking about the movement, we're in the midst of an anti-Trump movement in many ways. And it kind of takes me back to 12, 15 years ago. We were being part of the global justice movement, then being part of the anti-war movement. It was very much like an anti-Bush movement in many ways. 2008, Obama seizes that momentum and co-opts it, even using his own version of a dog whistle, yes we can, and hope and change, and Shepard Fairey's images of him. And then once Obama is in, and also I'll full disclosure, I work in the nonprofit and the environmental nonprofit industrial complex, and what I saw was that energy be co-opted to get Obama elected, one, and then two, once he's in, Obama demobilizes the movement. The sort of anti-Bush movement splits between liberals and left. The left is sort of browbeat into we have a friend in the White House. You're not doing anything but causing problems. You're just fueling the argument for the right. And my concern, I'm less worried about it than I was in 2009. But my concern is that once Trump's out of there, Biden's in. If whatever happens between now and that, the same thing will happen. I suspect that movements are after a decade of neoliberal Obamaism and then fascist Trumpism, that movements are going to be standing much more stronger. I think we've learned a lot, but it's still a fear and something for folks to think about. It's if Trump gets put out with whatever violence comes with that, but if the Democrats are back in power, then we need to not let up any more than we have today.
No, I couldn't agree more. Yeah, I definitely share that fear, Scott, and it's not something that I relished thinking about, because I remember the sort of way that it got defanged after Obama became president, and I am sort of emboldened by the fact that people are more or less virulently opposed to Biden, and if they are voting, on the left at least, and if they are voting for him, it's because they're holding their nose in doing so. but my hope is that people, like you said, have come to a point where they recognize that the choice between neoliberal technocratism and, overt fascism is not really a choice, and that like there's got to be some kind of broader alternative, and if we are going to find it, we're going to find it together in the streets.
Yeah, it's two different types of poison.
Exactly.
One which might be a little slower. And I will say that I'm like, since January 20th, 2009, we had Occupy, we had Ferguson, we had, Standing Rock, things like that, which I think, helped in some ways, like build a left. So.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think that they were vital in building the modern left, and I think that the inauguration of Trump, for better or worse, also did so.
Yeah.
Trump's the best organizer the left has had, unfortunately.
that is a sad state of affairs. Bob.
I mean, I'm not saying that with any relish, and I think you brought up something really important earlier, which is Biden and Obama are very different. I mean, politically they're the same, right? But Obama could kind of fake it that he was like cared about progressives, and he had the rhetoric and everything behind him, and allegedly this background as a community organizer. Everybody knows who Biden is. He's been around forever, 50 years, and he can't fake it. So I think people will be far less likely to say, okay, I mean, there are liberals think that's all you have to do is just get rid of Trump. But I haven't voted since I voted for Jesse Jackson. And I'm voting this year because I think you need to depose the Trump regime no matter how it's done. And, if you study even like, the Vietnamese or Cuban revolutions, electoral politics was a tactic. And that's how I look at it. It's a tactic. It's one of many, many, many tactics. It's not some kind of moral or theological thing. It's just one thing you can do. So I don't have any problem with voting against Trump, and I'm going to do it myself for the first time in decades, really, to get rid of him. But no, then at that point, things really kind of get hot, and you stay on. It's not even moving Biden to the left. I don't think that's feasible. I don't think that's possible. It's just doing your thing in the streets and getting people organized and dealing with movements and issues. I mean, if the Supreme Court is going to outlaw Roe v. Wade, you go to the streets and make sure that, women have the right to contraception and reproductive choice, so you just, to me, part of it is you get rid of the ruling regime, but then you just kind of take matters into your own hands and you kind of try to do it outside of that specter. Because with people like Schumer and Pelosi and all these geriatric corporatist, people around, you're not going to get anywhere. So just take control of it yourselves and, make sure women have a right to choice, make sure that people have some kind of adequate health care, or make sure people are fed or whatever, beyond, hoping that an 87-year-old woman with pancreatic cancer stays alive for another 3 months.
The worst fucking gamble that liberals could have possibly made. What a roll of the dice, right?
If she had been a Republican, they would have sent her fishing with Al Neary the day she got diagnosed. So
it's just, God.
We're very creative with our descriptions of the ruling class at the Green and Red podcast.
I appreciate that. Colorful metaphors are, I think, sort of lacking on the left. A lot of us are just like, the bourgeoisie, or people. A lot of people online like to refer to them as ghouls, but I like colorful stuff.
Yeah. No, Green and Red podcast, you get what we think are hilarious jokes. I'm not sure the listeners think that, but
listen, as long as we're entertaining ourselves, right? Like, I mean,
that's pretty much it. Yeah.
Oh my God. Well, to your point, right? Like, the struggle is like ultimately determined in the streets. I think, the three of us at least, kind of echo that sentiment, and it's one that I think, like, history has like shown to be like more or less true. Like that thesis has been meted out again and again. I think about Marx, like the history of all struggle has been like class struggle, right? Howard Zinn's idea that like history is made in the streets. It's not policymakers, it's not politicians, it's people in the streets. And so like with that in mind, I wanted to talk a little bit here in the second half of this discussion about like some of the practical ways that we can actually materially organize and get involved in the streets, because, one way or another, come November, there are going to be a lot more people in the streets. And that means that, people need to be prepared, and people need to have the skills and the tactics and the strategies that we can hopefully bring in some humble way and in some small measure here today. So I wanted to talk a little bit with y'all first and foremost about the idea of like what types of street actions we might see, because I think a lot of people hear like being in the street, and the first thing they think of, right, is people standing on a street corner just kind of waving around a cardboard sign, and that's not what we're talking about here. So as, Scott, maybe, as someone who's been doing this for a while, can you talk about some of the different types of street actions and what falls under that broad umbrella category?
Yeah, I mean, also, like, I've been a nonviolent direct action trainer. I've been a direct action trainer, not always nonviolent. I should say, for about 20 years. And so I see direct action as an umbrella term. And so it's very much applies to street action. And so it's everything from marches to occupations to sit-ins to like lockdowns, for folks who know what that is, where you chain yourself to something, to tree sits, which is another form of an occupation, to blockades. And then, and then there's like the ones in which are like, get a little more on the edgy side. We have things like sabotage and looting and things of that nature. And so I would say that during this George Floyd uprising, we've seen this in different moments in history, but during this George Floyd uprising, since the murder of George Floyd, I would say that we've seen the full spectrum has been run, and beyond that as well. A lot of people are out doing armed self-defense as well. And so it is, I believe, if we do enter into a period of a crisis around the election, where we see the Proud Boys maybe trying to go and intimidate vote counting in Philadelphia or something like that, then I actually, the Democrats in 2000 actually sat it out. Like there were union members who were ready to deploy to sort of like support vote counting in Florida. They didn't do that. Republicans did deploy. I see that is not going to be the case this time. That's my read on what's going to happen. And so it needs to be all levels of street action needs to happen everywhere. Essentially what it needs to do is like lead to like some sort of like disruption to the system, right? So, maybe you block highways, maybe you occupy a federal building, maybe you're protecting vote counting in a municipality somewhere. But I think it's all going to be like fairly important. A good friend of mine and a great organizer named Lisa Fithian, she told me after she had been in Ferguson during one of the, there were different times where they would have like days of actions or weeks of actions where she would just like go around to different parts of St. Louis and Ferguson, and there were all these different actions. And it wasn't always necessarily like a big march, but maybe it was like 10 people blocking the street, or maybe it was like a dozen people sitting in City Hall. But like all of these things happening at once, this cumulative effect is going to lead to some level of disruption that the ruling class will then decide that they need to act on.
Right. Yeah. Well said. Well said. Scott, you have anything to add there, my friend?
Or Bob, even?
Sorry, Bob.
I mean, Scott's definitely the expert at this. This is in his wheelhouse. I think one thing that struck me about what we've seen in 2020 is that I've seen protests in like Warren, Ohio, little town outside of where I am right now, and Vidor, Texas. If you know anything about that, that's like a hotbed of the Klan, and these little places. So the big stories are hundreds of thousands of people in DC and the Bay Area and New York and Portland and Seattle, but it's happening everywhere. And something that Scott mentioned, and I think it's important, and I'm not sure really how the left deals with this, is reform often occurs because the ruling class wants to stabilize the system amid these systemic crises and disruptions, which is what we're seeing today. And there's no doubt these people don't like Trump. They love the fact that he made them gazillions of dollars with, tax cuts and deregulation and all that. but he's destabilized the system now.
He's
and
clumsy.
So Wall Street, he's vulgar. He's not smooth like Biden would be. I mean, Biden and Trump are both kind of stewards of the same people, but Biden is a lot more reliable and stable and not gonna get as many people worked up. And so there is that tendency, I think, to like Scott pointed out, if you disrupt the system, you're going to have people who are going to say, okay, it's not worth it. Trump isn't that valuable to us that we, let the country blow up over him because of him, and so we have to remember that that's not necessarily a victory for the left, right? It's a cooptation, it's a preemption or a commodification. Sometimes they'll do that, like these big corporations are doing with their, we're going to give $10 million to Black Lives Matter and put up commercials, and Colin Kaepernick is going to get a Nike ad and all that kind of stuff. So, I think it's important to understand, what Scott said. I think everything should be on the table, and we have to be aware that, I don't have any problem with like preserving the vote. I think one of the people Scott and I have been very critical of, well, maybe more than him, is Stacey Abrams, who's become a liberal icon in Georgia for her, getting people to register for the vote. But every time she registers people to vote, the Secretary of State or the Republican governor ends up scrapping them, and they go to a local court with Republican judges who end up throwing it out as well. And then she's never done anything beyond that. They've never done sit-ins. They've never done lockdowns. And Scott can talk about corporate campaigns going after banks, going after corporations that support that particular ruling regime. And we don't see any of that. And that should be happening now. They shouldn't be waiting until the election. That should be going on right now.
Yeah.
But, and then, I think, the Democrats and liberals kind of turned things when, people were equating throwing a brick through Target with, cops killing unarmed people. And so that's something to look out for, because you're going to have to deal with that all the time. At some point, you just have to say, screw it, we're going to do what we do.
Totally. And I'm curious if you guys think, because it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, I'm curious if you think that we're going to see... like the liberals shut the fuck up for half a minute, like when shit hits the fan in November, and just kind of like let the radical, and then like use that radical energy to then co-opt it? Or do you think that we're still going, because Biden himself has, said like he would prosecute the anarchists, right? Yeah. And so like, I'm curious if you guys think that the Democrats increasingly have just like fucking rolled over for the GOP, like time and time and time again. And just shown their bellies at the first sign of, like any, like they don't put up any, the hashtag resistance doesn't put up any resistance, right? And so I'm curious.
This is where we get into those creative descriptions that Green and Red likes to put out there.
those yellow-bellied, craven blackers,
gutless,
gutless, spineless. Yeah, they're fools. But regardless, I'm curious. Do you think that? Do you think that it's possible that the liberals might, kind of step back some of that rhetoric, and then co-opt the energy later? Or do you think that, in order to, maintain the illusion of being balanced and fair-minded, they're going to continue, finger waving at the left?
I expect finger waving, but I just got chastised by like a half dozen people for being, mean or whatever, because I wished Trump ill when he got sick. So,
I think there'll be maybe a very brief moment, like a day, where there will be such a ferocious response from the street that the Democrats will be quiet. They'll probably put out their civility stuff. Maybe they'll be happy. It seems like we always have like we always have like about half a day to get away with being as ferocious as we want before they start trying to do the finger waving. I think it's important. Like that's like very performative, and I feel like at some level that some of them realize that like this is going to help them. When the NBA and other professional sports in August after the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting were like sitting out games and threatening to go on strike, and there's like this buzz about boycott versus strike and things like that. That went on for a minute before then we saw Obama like go talk to LeBron James and told him that voting was what we should do. blah, blah, blah. I do feel like they see the importance of a sort of like, I love the word ferocious today, the ferocious response from the street, but they're also like, they have corporate sponsors, right? There's corporate sponsored as the Republicans. And so they're going to have to also like kind of keep that together. And when the street also begins looking at like, not just politicians like Trump, but also, you know, corporations, like maybe we'll go fuck with Delta in Atlanta over like the voter suppression that they're getting away with in Georgia. Like then they're gonna like they'll not only scold us, but they'll like encourage us to like encourage the authorities to go after anarchist street organizers or whatever.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And don't get me wrong, I'm total bottom up grassroots anarchist direct action person, but like I do feel like there'll be a moment where there'll be an interplay.
Yeah, I mean, there's a kind of a historical school sort of coming out of the New Left that talked about reform from the top down. Reform often occurs because corporations see the need for this to kind of stabilize the system. And we do see that a lot. And it's really hard to break away from because you have these moments where things converge. I think it's important to understand the ruling class isn't homogenous. There are fissures, there are fractures and cracks in the ruling class that we can exploit. I think that's important. Like for one thing, like the military has stood up to Trump probably more than any other institution has. You know, certainly more than the Democratic Party has. So
that's a pretty low bar to clear, though.
Right, but I'm just saying, like, I think, you know, I mean, this is an area I study actually, military, very closely. So I think, you know, that's not to say that we should like laud people like Mattis, who's a war criminal, but you know, if you see that this institution, which is really important in you know, maintaining stability in America, you know, doesn't like Trump, I think that's something to be aware of. Right now that, you know, and figure out ways to deal with that and try to operate within that. But yeah, at the end of the day, that tendency of the ruling class to finally, you know, get together and crack down on their joint enemies, you know, is common. The other thing, though, that is like in terms of, you know, Trump creating openings, you know, if you read like the Washington Post or New York Times, these are very, you know, establishment figures writing there, these columnists and people like that. And they're writing stuff now that like, we would have been saying a few years ago but it's Trump directed. It's not systemic. It's Trump. They see Trump as this like ferocious monster who's, you know, so far out the mainstream. I never agreed with the idea that you should normalize Trump. I think Trump is normal. He's extreme. He's vulgar, but he's, you know, a really kind of a logical successor to, you know, everyone from Clinton and Obama included.
He's the id
know. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, good way to put it. Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, I think, yeah, that's something we have to be aware of, that the ruling class will kind of create these openings, which I think are useful, but, you know, you can't count on that to get where we need to be. It's totally inadequate. Just like I think the Green New Deal is totally inadequate, you know? So if that is, then clearly what Biden is offering is pretty weak, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
I do think that this moment, like there's this huge upsurge of organizing that has been going on this year. Even before the murder of George Floyd with COVID, we saw, you know, a lot of mutual aid. We saw a lot of labor actions. If you follow Mike Elk's website, it's like Payday Report. You know, he basically has a strike tracker, and that at any given point before George Floyd, I think it kind of like spun out of control, and I was too busy watching other things to watch it. But it was like any given point, there was 150 to 200 strike labor actions happening every day. And I do feel like there's a space being created in this moment. I feel like it's only going to get bigger and more as like we hurl towards election day and potentially afterwards. And I think it's an important thing that, you know, there's where the ruling class allows reform to happen from the top down. But like the other important thing happening here is like there's this a bottom up grassroots sort of like organizing and change happening there. And we should never lose sight of that. I think it's a very important thing.
Yeah. Well said.
Yeah, I mean, the Amazon strikes are a great example of that. How many different Amazon, you know, what do they call those? Fulfillment centers, the most fucking Orwellian term you'll ever hear. But,
it really is. Like, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Like, what kind of corporate double speak? Like, who was the person who branded that? That's just like it's truly galling.
Like Disney and, you know, everything together. But look at how many, you know, like just basically wildcats there have been, you know, at those, you know, many of them are over COVID, some are over wages, safety conditions. And that's why, like the labor leadership is really a barrier, just like the Democratic Party is a barrier. And I think that's kind of the problem, because a lot of people still are very much attached to that. It's hard to break away from that, especially now when Trump he's different. He's clearly, I think, a logical follower to people like Obama and Clinton, but he's also like so batshit insane and unhinged, and just the kind of open overtures to Proud Boys and things like that. That's for scary. And that's always, I think, been the biggest fear of Trump, is that he's unleashed and legitimated these really violent street forces, KKK, neo-Nazis, people who, now very proudly, walk around with swastikas and rebel flags, and he defends rebels, Confederate statues. And it's a different kind of thing. He's a different kind of cat. He's part of the ruling class, but he's their ugly, crazy cousin or something like that,
Right. Yeah. It's always interesting, like, like you said, the dialectic of Trump being like the normal, like, he is the America's id laid bare, but yet also simultaneously, like, in many ways, he's also unique. Well, maybe not unique. Unique might be the wrong word, but like he is a different sort of threat than Obama or Clinton or Bush or whomever,
And I do things like I think even Biden would understand COVID is a real thing. So 200,000 people have died, and I think that's to me, lefty value is keeping people alive.
Yeah.
So in that regard, I think separating Trump and condemning him is useful, and I think that's legit, because he has a lot of blood on his hands over something that really could have been handled easily.
Totally.
When it comes to stuff like Cuba, they're all the same. Biden, Trump, they're all the same. AOC, they're all the same. But when it comes to COVID, I think there's something like that. There's a significant difference that Trump is uniquely, dangerous on that regard.
Yeah, 100%. Well, y'all are both, proponents of kind of bottom-up organizing. I also wanted to ask a little bit about affinity groups, because, listeners, again, who are new, who may not be, super familiar with tactics or strategies, I feel like, one of the things that I always encourage people to do whenever they ask is to make or join an affinity group. Could we maybe talk a little bit about like what an affinity group is, what its basic purpose is, how those function at street actions, that sort of thing?
Sure.
That's Scott's expertise there.
Yeah. So affinity group, actually, it's, started the term, I think it existed for a long time before that term comes out of the Spanish Civil War, where Spanish anarchists fighting the fascists, formed just like small groups where there was like a certain level of like horizontal decision making or direct democracy, little d democracy. And that's what they used to resist the fascists, with like varying levels of success or failure. It sort of made a comeback in the late 60s, early 70s with the anti-nuclear movement, both in Europe and then in the US. And then we've seen it used a lot in movements, especially if you're coming more from like a sort of anarchist direct action background. So we saw it with the Central America Pledge of Resistance in the 80s. Earth First, for example, uses affinity group model a lot to do a lot of their backcountry actions. Very much during the protests against the World Trade Organization, we saw affinity groups actually successfully shut down the WTO meetings in November, December 1999. And so the idea is that it's like a group of friends, comrades, neighbors, co-workers that basically get together. Sometimes it's an ongoing affinity group, as I like to call it, that, basically can organize things. I'm part of such a group right now here in the Bay Area, or it can be an affinity group that just comes together for the purpose of an action. I would actually suggest to people that it is I would encourage you to form affinity groups for whatever's going to happen in November, because you need to go out in the street and you need to have people have your back. Make sure it's people you're close with, that you trust with, and importantly, that you align on like action. Like if one person in your group wants to throw a brick through a window and other people think that that's violent and has a more liberal sort of perspective on it, you want to be careful about like not having that sort of disagreement when you're in that moment. The other thing I'll say is that we did a lot of climate strike organizing here in the Bay Area last year, and we actually used affinity groups models and then spokes council, which is like a gathering of affinity groups to make decisions. We actually shut down the San Francisco Financial District. Commune of communes. and we like shut down the San Francisco financial district for the day, including the world headquarters of that evil banker, Jolly Bankers, Wells Fargo. And we literally like blocked out all of the employees where they were all just standing on the street waiting to get in.
That rocks.
Yep. And so I would like very much encourage people, also as a person who comes out of anarchist direct action organizing, I would very much encourage people to, research the affinity group model if you don't already know about it, and then go form an affinity group with your friends. And one of the things I'll say that we did during the climate strikes last year is I was working with the local Rising Tide chapter here in the Bay Area, and we did 2 months of direct action trainings where at the end of every training, we encourage people to form affinity groups. And by the end of the sort of like 2-month organizing process, we had like 30 or 40 affinity groups, which took action.
That's such a cool idea and like a sound strategy of like organizing people. That's super, super cool. I hope, God, I fucking hope that there are people doing that kind of work right now in prep for whatever is coming.
There are people right now working on November. I mean, there are groups doing it. I don't know how public they are, but yeah, there are definitely people who are already planning for that.
There's a organization formation grassroots in DC called Shutdown DC, which is in the process of doing that. We're going to start doing it in the Bay Area. I'm pretty sure things like that are been happening in Portland and Seattle. I mean, granted, those are like the bluest of the blue state parts of the country, but still, like I feel like it serves as an important model. There's also important pieces of the economy that be disrupted in all those places.
100%.
Or the political system.
100%. Yeah, and I mean, I know that I've had conversations with folks that I care about along those lines. I don't want to tattle on myself or tattle on any of my comrades before the fireworks start, but it's definitely the time. So, if you're listening to this and, this is something that you're passionate about, it's definitely a good idea to reach out to folks. And we're going to include a link in the show notes to a zine all about making affinity groups, which I find to be very helpful, especially, again, if the idea is new to you. The last thing that I kind of wanted to talk with y'all about...
Real quick on that. The other thing, the organizer I referenced earlier, Lisa Fithian, actually has a website called organizingforpower.org, which also has a lot of good resources for affinity group and other direct action organizing.
That's awesome. Okay, awesome. Well, I'll definitely link to that as well in the show notes, so you can check out all those resources. The last thing I wanted to touch on before we part ways, and God knows there's a million and one things we could talk about when it comes to thinking about street actions. There's a million and one things we could talk about when it comes to street actions, but I guess the last thing that I want to think about is coalition building. Because, and we've already talked a little bit about it, but I think, in the weeks and or months ahead, it's going to become even more vital than possible, than perhaps it's been, at least as long as I've been organizing, which is like a decade now, to have like good, strong coalitions, where even if you don't see eye to eye on everything, being able to build up numbers, and not letting liberals co-opt the righteous anger and fury of the people is, I think, going to be really important. And so I was wondering if y'all had any tips or strategies on, building coalitions, but also allowing those coalitions to retain their sense of radical urgency.
I've got bad blood with every group I've been associated with, so Scott's the guy to talk to on this. I've pissed off people in every group I've ever been in, so I'm kind of just a cranky old boomer now.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that in coalition building, I mean, definitely coming up with like a strategic framework of like, if your goal if your strategic goal is to just disrupt the economy, then like, I actually feel like coming up with strategies and goals before you talk about tactics, which I feel actually is where the sort of rubber hits the road for some of these groups. It's like the Against Me song, we held hands in the streets of Seattle, but when it came to put that brick through the Starbucks window, you left me all alone, right? I feel like coming out with like a strategic framework and goals and action guidelines and things like that are going to be really important in coalition work. And then when you kind of get into tactics, then there's like maybe there's a thing that we use here in the Bay called like respect the tone of the zone. And so maybe it's the zone where people are being confrontational with police or with fascists if fascists show up. And then there's other people who are going to be in a different zone where they want to do a more peaceful sit-in at a bank or something like that. It's like, but like this sort of like strategy, goals, and action guidelines kind of hammered out early can sometimes prevent coalitions from fraying and then being undermined or exploited by the bad guys.
Yeah. No, I think that's a sound philosophy. I think so often we are quick to put the cart before the horses, as it were, and we forget about, you know, we wanted to have as many people in the streets as possible, and we don't really think about like, okay, well, what is it we're trying to do here? Are we trying to do some form of sabotage? Are we trying to do some sort of economic shutdown? Are we trying to do some sort of blockade or occupation? You know, I think having those actual strategies and those goals in mind is really vital to the success of something, far more than building up numbers. What's that phrase? Don't be fooled into thinking that a small group of friends can't change the world. That's the only thing that ever has.
Yeah. Margaret Mead.
Yep.
The other thing I would say in the sort of coalition work is, you know, looking towards the voices of people most impacted also can be like a important, following that leadership I think is important, just hands down. But then also, you know, if you're following like Black or Indigenous leadership or whatever else, is that like that sometimes actually also like that will ease tensions, in my opinion, in some ways.
Yeah, for sure. No, I think that's sound advice.
Especially with liberals.
Especially with liberals. You beat me to the punch. That was about what I was literally going to say. So you stole the words right out of my mouth. I think we're right in the same wavelength here. Well, listen, y'all, this has been a really awesome conversation thinking about, you know, history and strategy and tactics and how to, and like I said, you know, there are resources out there, and Channel Zero Network has made a couple of them. You know, there are zines and websites and a lot of that stuff, as much as possible, I'm going to try to link to in the show notes. So definitely be sure to check those out. Scott and Bob, this has been awesome. Thank you both so much for agreeing to collaborate with me. I'm glad that we could finally make it happen. Before we part ways, can you let Coffee with Comrades listeners know where they can go to check out your podcast? And then I can let Green and Red podcast listeners know where to find Coffee with Comrades.
Yep. Probably the easiest thing to do is go to greenandredpodcast.org. We post everything there, but we're also on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. So,
hell yeah.
And why don't you tell the Green and Red audience where they can learn more about Coffee with Comrades?
I do want to let me thank you before we do that. I really appreciate this and hope to do good. And good luck on your doctoral work.
Thanink you so much. Yeah, thanks.
Looking forward to see your book published in a few years with, you know, getting all kinds of awards and Pulitzer prizes. So, thanks so much.
Yeah, of course. I don't want any awards or prizes. The biggest award or prize would be if people just read it. You know that, especially in academic settings, that's the hardest thing, is finding, you know, a readership. Which makes me think more and more I don't really want to publish in academic writing. I want to do like, you know, other markets. But I digress. Yeah, this has been great. Coffee with Comrades is a podcast you can find pretty much anywhere you go to pick up your favorite podcasts: Apple, Spotify, Google Play, what have you. You can also go to www.coffeewithcomrades.com, and we have a Patreon as well, which is patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades. Awesome. Y'all, let's not be strangers. Let's do this again sometime in the future and maybe circle back and talk about something else. This has been fun.
Yeah, this has been great. Much thanks.
Sure. Solidarity, y'all.
Yep. Back at you, man.
With protests continuing in cities all over the world, the Channel Zero Network has some reminders on how to support those who have been arrested and those who may be arrested in the coming days and weeks.
Arrests are one tool cops use to repress mass movements. Arrests keep protesters off the streets during demonstrations. They scare people with the threat of court cases and potential prison sentences. Alone, we feel defenseless against the police and the courts. By providing jail and court support, we can push back against this repression, from the moment our comrades are taken in to the end of their court case.
Before heading out into the streets, make sure you and everyone you're with has a contact number written on their body. You'll need to get in touch with someone if you're arrested, and you most likely won't have your personal belongings with you. This number can be the National Lawyers Guild, a group you're currently involved with, or just a friend who's not at the protest.
If you see someone getting arrested, call your legal support number with the arrestee's legal name and birthday. If you're in a large city, you may have to determine where they will be taken. Try to find the arresting officer's precinct or unit. This may determine where your comrade ends up. In smaller cities, everyone may go to the same place.
If you expect more arrests, try to stay and observe. If not, you should head to the precinct and wait for the arrestee.
Once at the precinct, use the legal name and birthday of the arrestee to ask the cops for the arrest number, charges, and where the arrestee will be taken or held. Keep anyone supporting you in a loop.
Be prepared to wait many hours. Keep in touch with others and take turns waiting outside the precinct. In some cases, it may take the whole night, especially if there's been a mass arrest.
From here, each city and state has different processes and different jargon. Connect with local organizers and read about local laws to learn what the process will be in your area. Here are some things you might encounter.
Sometimes arrestees are released quickly with a notice that they'll need to show up in court at a later date. If this happens, take the contact info of the arrestee. You'll want to be ready to offer them court support in the future.
Sometimes, arrestees are charged before release. This is a longer process, usually called arraignment, which is a procedural court hearing to file charges and set bail. The court will assign a public defender for arraignments. Try to have a couple of friends attend the arraignment for support. Due to COVID-19, you may only be able to observe via video.
Sometimes arrestees will have to post bail to be released. If bail is set, let the court officer know you're arranging payment and will be coordinating with the arrestee's lawyer. If you need support making bail, connect with local organizers. There may be a bail fund for protesters in your area.
No matter what happens, always relay what's happening to other people offering support.
Regardless of the legal situation the arrestee ends up in, you'll need to bring some things with you. People who are getting out may be exhausted or have trouble getting home. So bring snacks, water, aspirin, bus fare, transit cards, and cigarettes. If you have a friend being held, you can bring their favorite snacks. If you know the arrestee requires specific medication, make sure to bring that too.
You'll also need water and snacks to sustain yourself. Bring external batteries for charging phones as you may be waiting many hours.
If you can't stay and help with jail support, dropping off materials to those waiting can be a big help.
Unfortunately, there is a high risk of exposure to COVID-19 while in an enclosed jail cell. Arrestees should consider self-quarantining and getting tested.
For every street action and every viral video of arrests, there are dozens of people outside the spotlight supporting the movement. It's not over till everyone's safely gotten out of prison and everyone's beaten their charges.
Check out Rebel Steps jail support episode at rebelsteps.com/jail support for more tips and resources.
And follow Unicorn Riot and Channel Zero Network member It's Going Down for more updates.
The Channel Zero Network sends y'all solidarity.
Stay safe out there and never stop fighting for a better world.
And that about does it for this week's episode of Coffee with Comrades. This is an entirely DIY show run by workers for workers. If you like what you hear, you can follow us on Twitter at CoffeeWComrades and Instagram at CoffeeWithComrades. Check out our website, www.coffeewithcomrades.com, and sign up to support our work with a monthly contribution by going to www.patreon.com/coffeewithcomrades. You can find Coffee with Comrades on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you go to get your anti-capitalist propaganda. Be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. While you're there, smashing that subscribe button, be sure to rate and review the show as well to help us increase our reach. If you have feedback, criticism, or you'd just like to get in touch with us, shoot us an email at coffeewithcomrades@gmail.com. Until next time, stay wild out there, comrades.